At 11:17 a.m. on March 9, 1945, Staff Sergeant Frank "Tank" Kowalski held his breath inside the smoking turret of the M4A3E8 Sherman, named Iron Maiden. They were 400 yards from the shattered approaches to the Remagen and Beachhead, pushing the limits of the American spearhead into the heart of the Reich. The unmistakable, sickening cracking sound of a German 88mm gun firing from the relative safety of a wooded crest split the cold, wet air. Kowalski didn't need to look. He knew the trajectory. It wasn't aimed at the thick frontal glacis plate, which had been reinforced with welded-on tracks and sandbags. The German gunner, likely a veteran of a Jagdpanzer unit, had aimed for the weak side skirt armor, slightly rearward of the driver's hatch, a vulnerable point on every standard M4. But the armor on the Iron Maiden wasn't standard. This was his own desperate, illegal creation. Over the last 4 weeks of bitter fighting, Kowalski and his small crew of mechanics and former engineers had hammered, cut, and welded together stolen scrap metal. CAPTURED, German steel sections, and most crucially, the salvaged aluminum from 12 dozen melted-down U.S. Army water canteens. He had formed this hybrid, crude, spaced armor system, a last-ditch attempt to survive the German high-velocity cannons that effortlessly ripped through American tanks. He waited for the explosion that would end their war, the fiery penetration that would turn the Sherman into a screaming oven. Instead, the projectile hit with a loud, sickening, wet thud, a sound that spoke not of penetration, but of a catastrophic loss of energy. A massive shower of metal shards and burning aluminum spalled off the exterior, but the shot did not penetrate the primary hull plate. For an agonizing second, the Iron Maiden and the 4 men huddled inside survived a shot it absolutely should not have. This was the 32nd Armored Regiment's Ordnance Orphans, a collection of mechanical misfits and technical delinquents led by men like Kowalski. They were the unofficial, unloved, and yet undeniably essential heart of the American advance, the engineers of desperation. Frank Kowalski was 23 years old, originally from a working-class neighborhood in Chicago, and he had a reputation in the motor pools that preceded him like a plume of burning oil. He didn't follow the manual. If the book said a part lasted 100 hours, Kowalski figured out how to make it last 500 by modifying tolerances or introducing unauthorized lubricants. He didn't steal supplies to enrich himself. He stole to survive, and he treated the official U.S. Army Field Manual less like scripture and more like a set of helpful suggestions to be immediately disregarded if a better solution presented itself. The regular Army viewed men like Kowalski as a problem. They demanded standardization, uniformity, and strict adherence to approved modification lists. Kowalski's superiors saw his knack for jury-rigging engine components and fabricating replacement transmission seals out of scrap metal as indiscipline, even outright insubordination. He had 3 official reprimands before he even saw the coast of France, all related to modifying vehicles for better performance, rather than maintaining them to specification. But the reality of combat, the reality of watching a standard M4 Sherman tank burn after being hit by the 7.5 centimeters KWK-42 of a Panther changed perspectives quickly. The frontline tankers didn't want tanks that were standard. They wanted tanks that were alive. Kowalski found his salvation in the 743rd Tank Battalion, a unit that, after suffering catastrophic losses in the fighting following Operation Cobra, had quietly begun to embrace necessity over regulation. Their commander, Major Elias Vance, a pragmatic West Pointer who understood the difference between doctrine and survival, had decided that a slightly modified, rule-breaking tank was infinitely more valuable than a perfectly standard burning one. Major Vance had collected the Orphans. They were men like Kowalski, former mechanics, welders, structural steel workers, and even a handful of ex-cons who knew how to procure materials that officially didn't exist in their supply chain. Their training wasn't about parades and textbook maneuvers. It was about survival engineering. It was a crash course in using everything the battlefield provided to compensate for the Sherman's inherent weaknesses against the heavy German armor now dominating the battlefield. They modified their M4 South until they were nearly unrecognizable. They lowered the suspension, illegally, for a lower profile. They installed external filtration systems designed for trucks to protect the engines from the grinding mud of the German countryside. Most critically, they addressed the armor problem. The Sherman, even the late model M4A3E8, with its excellent 76 mm high-velocity gun, was a target magnet. German armor-piercing rounds often had enough residual energy after punching through the main hull to create lethal secondary fragments spall inside the crew compartment, turning shrapnel into a guaranteed killer. Kowalski's solution was radical. Spaced armor constructed not just from standard steel plate, but from an almost impossible mix of materials. He discovered that by melting down aluminum canteens, which were plentiful after every skirmish, and casting them into thick, crude blocks, he could create a layer of relatively soft, yet strong material. When placed roughly 2 inches away from the main hull armor, this aluminum layer had an astounding effect. An armor-piercing round, such as the 88 mm just fired at the Iron Maiden, hit the aluminum layer first. The impact shattered and distorted the softer metal, causing the projectile to yaw, tumble, or fragment slightly before it even reached the main steel hull. This premature distortion stripped critical velocity and energy, often resulting in a clean defeat of the round ore, as the tankers grimly called it, taking the bite out of the big dogs. It was a modification that the Ordnance Corps would have court-martialed them for. But at 11:18 a.m., with the turret still ringing from the impact near Remagen, it was the only thing keeping Kowalski and his men alive. The German gunner, surprised the Iron Maiden hadn't erupted in flames, was already reloading. Kowalski knew the next shot would be aimed higher, likely trying to hit the more vulnerable turret ring. He had approximately 15 seconds to locate the German 88, or the crude, canteen-based armor system would be rendered useless, and the Iron Maiden would become just another smoking wreck in the advance to the Rhine. The internal concussion from the 88 mm hit was a brutal physical shockwave, even though the shell hadn't penetrated. Shrapnel from the disintegrating aluminum plates, and the shell's cap had scraped across the main hull like a giant claw. Private First Class Tommy Fuse Miller, the driver, gripped the controls, his knuckles white. "Jesus Christ, Frank, what the hell was that?" Miller's voice crackled over the intercom, thin with adrenaline. "That," Kowalski replied, already traversing the turret violently to the right, "was our lucky day, Miller. Or rather, our ugly engineering paying off." It was 11:18 a.m., and the clock was ticking. Kowalski pressed his eye to the periscope, desperately scanning the dense tree line 400 yards ahead. The German crew would be frantically pushing the next 88 mm round into the breach. He calculated they had between 12 and 15 seconds before the high-velocity death came screaming back. "Gunner, heat round. Traverse right, Mark 270. Look for the smoke signature, directly above the damaged timber pile." Corporal Eddie "Wrench" Jenkins, the gunner, was already working the controls, his breathing ragged. Wrench was the other half of the Orphans brain trust, a former shipyard welder who had taught Kowalski the specific techniques needed to bond the crude aluminum casts to the hardened steel with maximum structural integrity. Jenkins had initially been skeptical of using melted canteens, but survival made men believe in miracles forged in desperation. The theory behind Kowalski's Iron Maiden modification, christened by Wrench after the heavy, ugly plates they added, was simple physics applied to lethal realities. The standard M4A3E8 had a 38 mm thick vertical side hull. The added spaced armor, composed of 4 inches of air gap and 1 inch of cast aluminum, derived from melting down approximately 24 canteens per section, was intended to pre-detonate or destabilize kinetic energy, KE, rounds. German high-explosive anti-tank heat rounds would also perform poorly, detonating too early to form the focused jet required for penetration. The aluminum was crude, full of impurities, but it did its job. "I see it," Jenkins shouted, his voice cracking with relief and focus. Small puff, 6 yards left of the cluster of burnt pines. Range 415. At 11:19 a.m., the target was acquired. It was a well-camouflaged PaK-43 anti-tank gun, a fearsome weapon capable of killing the Sherman at 2,000 yards. Fire! The Sherman's 76mm high-velocity main gun roared, momentarily silencing the internal noise and slamming the crew with recoil. The heat, high-explosive anti-tank round, traveling at 2,600 feet per second, streaked toward the hidden position. The shot struck exactly where Jenkins had aimed, not on the PaK-43 itself, but on the small, wooden ammunition stack positioned beside the gun, designed for rapid reloading. A blinding flash and a secondary detonation, the cooking off of the German propellant bags erupted, showering the concealed position with splintered wood and metal fragments. The German gun ceased to be a threat. "We got him. Keep moving, Miller." "Straight through the gap. We don't stop for prayers," Kowalski ordered, wiping the sweat from his brow, his hands still shaking slightly. The tank lurched forward, following the muddy tracks of the lead company. The immediate crisis was averted, but the cost and the illegality of their survival were always weighing on Kowalski. The truth was that the Orphans unit hadn't been created by Major Vance out of foresight, but out of necessity and a terrible record of personnel management. In the frantic post-D-Day push, the Allied logistics system was chronically strained. Replacement tanks arrived, but replacement parts, especially unique, high-stress parts like transmission gearing or specialized engine filters, were often months away. Kowalski's core crew of 4 men all, officially classified as mechanics, armored division, substandard compliance, had effectively become mobile factory repair crews. They carried welding torches scavenged from abandoned rail yards, cutting tools stolen from French workshops, and a massive supply of unauthorized materials. Their reputation for survival engineering was not built on innovation, but on practical necessity. When a standard M4 transmission failed due to excessive stress, the manual dictated a full replacement. The replacement was 500 miles away and 10 days out. Kowalski fixed it in 8 hours by welding and grinding salvaged gear components from a burnt-out Daimler armored car and reinforcing the whole assembly. With scrap plate repair that the Ordnance Corps claimed was impossible, but which kept the tank in the fight. This reliance on improvisation extended to their fuel. On 3 separate occasions during the push through the Ardennes, they had modified their engines to run on mixtures of low-grade captured diesel and even high-octane aviation fuel scavenged from downed Luftwaffe planes, adjusting the carburetors and ignition timing on the fly. This was an electrical engineer's nightmare, but a tanker's salvation. The melting of canteens, an absolute violation of property laws, punishable by serious charges, was the culmination of this desperate philosophy. Kowalski calculated that the sacrifice of 24 canteens per side of the HULL, 144 canteens total, for the Iron Maiden was a reasonable exchange for the 40% increased chance of surviving a mid-range impact from the German 75mm and 88mm guns. As the Iron Maiden pressed toward the objective, a critical crossroads, junction just 2 miles ahead, Kowalski knew the price of this engineering. If they failed, they would be court-martialed for theft, destruction of government property, and unauthorized modifications. If they succeeded, they would be forgotten men who simply survived another impossible day. But survival required constant adaptation. Ahead, through the thinning smoke of the ruined German anti-tank position, another challenge emerged. The road was blocked, not by mines or debris, but by two massive, disabled King Tiger tanks, their size dwarfing the M4 South. They weren't abandoned. They were dug in, their 88mm cannons waiting. The engineers of desperation would need more than melted canteens to solve this. They needed a miracle, and Kowalski was about to invent one. It was 11:27 a.m. The Iron Maiden had advanced 800 yards since the 88mm engagement. The objective, the junction known locally as the Four Horsemen Crossing, was now in sight, heavily guarded by two derelict yet formidable German tanks, two massive Panzer VAU SFB, the King Tigers. The term derelict was misleading. They were disabled, one with a blown track, the other with clear fire damage to its engine compartment from a previous engagement, but they were tactically positioned and fully crewed. Their turrets were traversed and waiting. The King Tiger's frontal armor was virtually impenetrable to the 76mm guns of the American Shermans, especially at this range of 1,200 yards. They were immovable, 70-ton concrete bunkers bristling with lethal ordnance, completely blocking the crucial access road to the town of Erpel. Major Vance's voice came over the radio, tight with frustration. "Iron Maiden, this is command. We are taking heavy fire from the King Tigers. They are dug in effectively as fixed pillboxes. We need a way to flank. Do you see an alternative route?" Kowalski scanned the terrain through the periscope. The road was lined on one side by a crumbling factory complex, now reduced to rubble, and on the other by a steep, waterlogged ravine that dropped 40 feet to a small, fast-moving stream. There was no flanking maneuver possible. Any attempt to cross the rubble would expose their soft underbelly to the 88s. "Command, negative on flanking route," Kowalski reported. "The road is the only viable path. We can't punch through those frontally, Major. We'll be burned alive." The King Tigers were designed for this kind of defensive fight. Their 88mm L-71 main guns could pierce the Sherman's thickest point like paper from 2 miles away. Any attempt to engage frontally was suicide. The standard operating procedure, SOP, dictated waiting for air support or bringing up heavy artillery, which would take hours they did not have, as the rest of the American column was stalling behind them, exposed to mortar fire. Kowalski had two impossible options, forming a brutal tactical dilemma: gatillo di tenso. Option 1, the doctrinal approach. Hold position. Request a coordinated artillery strike, risking the artillery missing or not being powerful enough to neutralize the heavy armor, and wait for infantry to clear the area, accepting the high probability of immediate casualties and a massive delay in the advance. Option 2, the orphan approach. Use their unique, illegal mechanical capabilities to create a situation that the King Tigers were not expecting, pushing their luck and the structural limits of the M4 Sherman to the absolute breaking point. Kowalski chose option 2. "Command, we are going to attempt a bypass using the factory rubble and the ravine," Kowalski transmitted. "Request permission to proceed under maximum velocity screening smoke." There was a long pause on the radio. Major Vance knew what Kowalski meant. Bypassing the King Tigers meant driving a 33-ton tank over terrain explicitly designated as impassable for armor. It meant using the tank as engineering capacity in a manner that was certain to damage the running gear. "Iron Maiden, proceed with caution." Vance finally graded out. "If you get stuck, you're on your own. Godspeed." At 11:32 a.m., Kowalski gave the order. "Wrench, lay smoke. Miller, we're taking the factory path. Hold on to your guts." Wrench fired the smoke dischargers, rapidly obscuring the battlefield. The Iron Maiden surged forward, deviating from the paved road and slamming into the jagged rubble of the ruined factory. The challenge wasn't just the height of the debris, but the instability. Buried under the crushed brick and splintered concrete were twisted iron girders and sections of track that could snag the M4's running gear or lift a section of track clear off the ground, leaving the tank stranded and exposed. Miller, driving like a man possessed, slammed the heavy M4 over the debris, pushing the tank's powerful Ford V8 engine to its limits. The tank pitched and yawed violently. Inside, men were thrown against the bulkheads, but Kowalski maintained his vigil, guiding Miller. "Easy, Miller. You're riding too high on the left. Grind that column down." Suddenly, the tank lurched sideways with a terrifying metallic groan. One of the tracks had slipped into a deep, hidden crater concealed by the rubble. The Sherman tilted dangerously, exposing the soft, lightly armored belly and the suspension system to the waiting 88mm guns. The Germans, realizing the Americans were attempting a desperate maneuver, began firing blindly into the smoke. Explosions shook the ground around the Iron Maiden. "We're stuck," Miller screamed. "Track is spinning. We're dead." At 11:34 a.m., Kowalski realized they were perfectly jammed, one track spinning uselessly in the air, the other buried in the muck. This was the moment the Ordnance Orphans had trained for, not by the book, but by necessity. "Wrench, get the cutting torch. Gunner, get the external toolkit. We're welding ourselves out." The plan was insane. Kowalski intended to fabricate a temporary, heavy-duty shackle and weld it directly onto the track links and drive sprocket, under heavy fire and exposed to fragmentation, to provide the necessary purchase to drag the tank out of the crater. It was improvised field maintenance on the scale of extreme survival engineering, and it had to happen in less than 90 seconds before the King Tigers got a clear visual on their immobilized target. The King Tigers were firing at intervals of 15 seconds, systematically spraying the area where the smoke screen was thickest. The blasts were closer, now heavy, earth-shaking concussions that threatened to roll the already listing Iron Maiden completely onto its side. It was 11:34 a.m., and Kowalski estimated they had maybe 2 more minutes before the smoke dissipated enough for the German gunners to pinpoint their position. "Hurry up. Wrench, get that oxygen flowing." Kowalski yelled, throwing open the driver's hatch and scrambling out onto the hull. The scene outside was chaos. The acrid smell of burning cordite mixed with the metallic dust of the pulverized factory complex. Kowalski and Wrench, ignoring the incoming 88mm fragmentation rounds hitting the debris nearby, worked with frantic speed. They needed to execute a precision fabrication job using tools and materials never intended for such rapid external use. Their primary obstacle was the slick, damaged track that refused to grip the jagged concrete edge. Kowalski grabbed a section of salvaged, L-shaped structural steel part of an old boilerplate stolen from a French railway depot weeks ago, and positioned it as a makeshift anchor cleat across the slipping track links. This steel was heavy and required Wrench to hold it steady against the tank's hull, while Kowalski secured the arc welding leads. Wrench activated the mobile arc welder, an oversized, unauthorized unit they carried lashed to the rear deck, modified for faster heating and portability. The sudden, intense bluish-white light of the arc welding torch cut through the thick gray smoke. This was extreme survival engineering in its purest form. They weren't replacing a part. They were creating a temporary, load-bearing solution, a massive metal hook that needed to withstand the full torque of the 33-ton tank trying to pull itself free. "Hold it steady, Wrench," Kowalski shouted, the sound of the welder hiss almost drowning him out. Sparks flew everywhere, burning through his greasy coveralls. The challenge was not only the enemy fire, but the material itself. They were welding high-carbon boilerplate onto the tank's manganese steel track links, a process that requires slow, careful preheating and cooling to prevent brittle fracture. They had neither the time nor the equipment for slow cooling. They had to fuse the metal quickly, accepting that the resulting joint would be ugly, flawed, and stressed beyond specification. At 11:35 a.m., a German He round landed about 15 feet away. The force of the explosion slapped Kowalski against the hull. He momentarily lost his vision, the smell of cordite thick and sharp in his nostrils. A fragment ripped through the canvas covering their external tools, but both men were miraculously untouched, protected by the brief elevation of the hull plates. "Are you hit?" Kowalski demanded, fighting the ringing in his ears. "Just deaf." Wrench shot back, his face grimed with soot and sweat. "One more pass, Kowalski. Get the top edge." Kowalski focused, pushing the arc deep into the joint, fusing the heavy steel cleat to the track. The metal hissed and glowed cherry red. This was the moment of maximum risk. They were outside the protection of the Iron Maiden C custom armor, vulnerable to every rifle bullet and fragment in the air. Inside the turret, the loader, Private Harris, was screaming coordinates to the tank commander, monitoring the increasing clarity of the air around them. "Smoke thinning on the right flank, Frank. They're going to see us in 30 seconds. At the 20-second mark, Kowalski pulled the electrode away. The cleat was roughly welded, but seemingly solid. "Miller, slowly engage the track. We go now." Kowalski and Wrench tumbled back inside the driver's hatch, just as the Iron Maiden groaned, the engine screaming. The temporary steel cleat bit into the solid concrete foundation of the factory floor, providing the necessary traction. Slowly, agonizingly, the Sherman crawled out of the crater, scraping against the wreckage until it reached level ground, slightly deeper into the factory ruins. They were free, but they were still not past the King Tigers. The maneuver had taken them perpendicular to the road, deep into the ruined factory compound. They had bypassed the immediate anti-tank kill zone, but they were now directly exposed on their flank, only 300 yards from the King Tigers, which were traversing their massive turrets toward the source of the sound. Kowalski slammed the hatch shut. "Wrench, low DP. Miller, full reverse. We are backing up to the ravine edge." He was now attempting the second, and most dangerous, part of his desperate maneuver. The ravine was steep, muddy, and 40 feet deep. Normal doctrine forbade taking tanks anywhere near such a drop. But Kowalski had a theory about using the terrain itself as a weapon, a way to eliminate the King Tigers without engaging them frontally. They were going to use the Iron Maiden to turn the seemingly impassable ravine into a tactical advantage. But they had to reach the edge before the King Tigers locked onto them, because at 300 yards, even Kowalski's Canteen Armor wouldn't stop an 88mm L-71 round. Miller punched the accelerator, the Iron Maiden roaring backward, throwing a massive spray of mud and dust. The tank, despite its improvised repairs, held true. They were racing toward the lip of the ravine. At 11:37 a.m., the Iron Maiden skidded to a violent halt just 3 feet from the lip of the ravine. Inside, the crew was thrown forward. The air was thick with the smell of engine heat, burning metal, and adrenaline. Kowalski was pressed against the commander's scope, his heart hammering against his ribs. The view was terrifying. Directly opposite them, roughly 300 yards across a stretch of open ground, sat the two King Tigers. They had fully traversed their turrets, their long 88mm guns angled directly at the factory compound. They had a visual on the Iron Maiden. The first King Tiger fired. The round screamed past the Sherman's position, vaporizing a section of the ruined factory wall 20 yards to their left. The pressure wave hit the Iron Maiden, rattling the entire tank. The German gunner was correcting the aim. The next shot would be lethal. "Miller, half a yard back. We need room to maneuver." Kowalski yelled. "Wrench, traversing left. We are only going to expose the turret." The Iron Maiden inched backward, the ground soft and muddy beneath the tracks, the 40-foot drop yawning behind them. Kowalski's plan was utter madness, a direct contravention of every safety and tactical rule in the book. He intended to use the steep, slick slope of the ravine as a temporary mobile ramp. His objective was not to drive into the ravine, but to use the slope to elevate the Iron Maiden. S main gun enough to target the one weak point of the King Tiger tanks that was usually inaccessible: the thin, vertical armor protecting the bottom third of the hull, the Bouchplatte, normally hidden by the ground. The American 76mm AP armor-piercing rounds were insufficient against the thick, sloped frontal armor, 100 to 180 millimeters, of the King Tiger. However, if they could strike the unsloped lower hull, which was only about 60 millimeters thick at a downward angle, the 76 millimeters might have a chance of penetration, or at least of jamming the tracks and disrupting the crew. Miller, drive forward 3 feet, then hold the brakes. I need a perfect angle. The King Tiger on the left, the one designated Tiger 203, fired again. This time the impact was frighteningly close, ripping up earth directly in front of the Iron Maiden. Shrapnel pinged harmlessly off the reinforced canteen armor. The German gunners were achieving their firing solution. Now, Miller, forward! The Sherman lunged toward the edge. The weight of the tank hit the muddy lip of the ravine. Instead of sinking, the front half of the tank dipped sharply downward, hanging precariously over the void. The gun muzzle, which had been horizontal, was now pointing sharply downwards, exactly as Kowalski needed. The Iron Maiden was balanced on the brink of disaster, its tracks churning uselessly in the air behind it. Jenkins, Tiger 203, lower hull. Fire for effect. Wrench Jenkins, the gunner, had already adjusted the elevation to maximum depression, a negative angle that was normally unusable in flat combat. The 76mm gun roared. The AP round struck Tiger 203 exactly at the join between the lower hull and the track assembly. The angle of attack was optimal near 90 degrees to the plate. Instead of penetrating the main plate, the shot ripped deep into the thinner lower hull, detonating internal equipment and shattering the track guides. A flash of fire erupted from the German tank's hull. Tiger 203 was crippled, its fighting capability neutralized. Its great gun, previously aimed at the Iron Maiden, dipped impotently. But now, the second King Tiger, Tiger 205, had its chance. It traversed slightly, aiming squarely at the vulnerable hanging Sherman. The second 88mm round left the German barrel. It was a perfect shot. Kowalski knew he couldn't survive another hit, even with his improvised armor. They were completely exposed. Miller. Full reverse. We're coming off. The driver slammed the controls backward. The M4's tracks grabbed the lip of the ravine, dragging the tank back from the 40-foot drop. The 88mm round impacted exactly where the Iron Maiden had been half a second before, creating a massive crater on the precipice, scattering mud and debris over the retreating Sherman. They were safe for the moment, dragged back behind the factory rubble, but only one King Tiger was out of the fight. The second one was furious, and now knew exactly where they were. They had to repeat the maneuver, and they had to be faster, because the German gunner on Tiger 205 was already locking his sight on the exact spot where the Iron Maiden had dared to appear. Want to know if Kowalski and his Ordnance Orphans survived what came next, and how they took down the second behemoth? Hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm this story matters and helps more people discover it. Subscribe for more untold World War II stories of survival engineering and desperation. Back to the Iron Maiden. It was 11:40 a.m. The Iron Maiden was pulled back from the ravine, its engine idling roughly. Inside the turret, the crew was a unified nod of exhaustion and focused aggression. The first King Tiger, 203, was visibly smoking, immobilized, but the second King Tiger, 205, was still fully operational, its massive gun traversing slowly, waiting for the American tank to reappear at the ravine edge. Kowalski knew the German gunner was expecting the same move. Repetition meant death. He had to change the variables, but the terrain remained fixed, and the fundamental problem, the inferiority of the 76mm against the King Tiger's frontal armor, remained absolute. "Wrench, load another AP," Kowalski commanded, his voice hoarse. "But hold the shot." He turned his attention to Miller. "Miller, we are going to drive forward again, but this time we aren't stopping at the lip." Miller's face, visible in the dim light of the fighting compartment, was pale. "Not stopping?" "Frank, if we go over, we're 40 feet down. We roll." "We will not roll," Kowalski insisted, grabbing the schematic diagram for the Sherman suspension, a diagram he had long ago annotated with his own authorized modifications. "The bank is too steep for a clean roll, but the mud is slick. We'll slide. We need momentum. We are going to intentionally put the tank into a controlled, low-velocity slide down the embankment." This was the pinnacle of the orphan approach. It required understanding the mechanical limits of the M4 far beyond the manual scope. The Sherman suspension was rugged, designed to absorb high impacts, but a 40-foot slide at a 60-degree angle would strain the bogies, tracks, and internal engine mounts severely. The risk of breaking a track or worse, crushing the rear drive sprocket against the base of the ravine, was enormous. But if they could execute the slide, they would achieve two crucial tactical advantages. 1. Lower profile. They would be momentarily concealed by the lip of the ravine as they descended. 2. Unique firing angle. They would gain an even steeper, more stable angle of depression at the ravine floor, allowing them to target Tiger 205's weaker top armor, or potentially the vulnerable turret ring, as they came to a stop. At 11:42 a.m., Kowalski finalized the preparation. He ordered Harris, the loader, to secure every loose item in the turret, using canvas straps and even field wire, anything that could become lethal shrapnel during the violent maneuver. Miller, when I say go, full speed ahead for 3 seconds, then cut the throttle entirely. "Just before we hit the lip, steer hard left. We want to hit the slope slightly sideways to scrub off speed." Miller nodded, swallowing hard. "Roger that, Frank." Kowalski took a deep breath. "This is it, men. For the junction." He threw open the commander's hatch one last time, checking the ground. The King Tiger 205 remained fixed, waiting for the Iron Maiden to show its nose at the same spot. Go, go, go. The M4A3E8 surged forward, engine roaring. The King Tiger crew was instantly alerted. At 11:43 a.m., Tiger 205 fired its 88 millimeters. The round struck the ground where Kowalski had initiated the charge, missing the tank by feet due to the Sherman's high speed. But the Iron Maiden didn't stop. It hit the lip of the ravine at 15 miles per hour. Miller cut the throttle and wrenched the steering yoke. The world inside the tank dissolved into a blur of violent motion and ear-splitting noise. The front of the Iron Maiden dropped. Instead of rolling over, the tank's momentum, combined with the slick mud, transformed the descent into a controlled, grinding slide. The tracks screamed against the embankment, throwing massive clods of dirt and water. The Iron Maiden hit the base of the ravine with a sickening crash that shook the entire crew. The impact was violent, but the tank remained upright, its engine surprisingly still running. They were now on the ravine floor, 40 feet below the King Tigers, who were looking down at them in sheer disbelief. This was their moment. Because they were so low, the King Tiger's main 88 millimeters gun, designed for horizontal combat, could not depress low enough to target the Sherman's hull at the base of the ravine. The elevation armor on the front of the King Tiger's mantlet physically prevented the gun from aiming that low. The Orphans had found a tactical blind spot born from the constraints of superior German engineering. Wrench, traverse up, target the top turret rim, or the engine deck. Fire everything we have. The Iron Maiden was undamaged and positioned perfectly. The 76 millimeters high-velocity gun roared, its trajectory now almost vertical as it aimed at the massive German tank looming above them. They had bypassed the impossible front armor by exploiting the impossible terrain. It was 11:44 a.m. The Iron Maiden had come to rest at a precarious angle at the foot of the 40-foot ravine. Above them, the two king tigers, one crippled, the other lethal, loomed like angry giants. The German crew of Tiger 205 was in a state of confused panic. Their primary weapon, the magnificent 88mm L-71, could not engage the tiny American Sherman directly below their line of sight. They were looking down the barrel of their own tactical arrogance. They had been engineered to destroy targets horizontally, not vertically. The M4, positioned barely 50 yards away at the ravine's base, was in a defensive blind spot. Kowalski was screaming into the intercom, coordinating the attack. Wrench, rapid fire. 3 rounds into the top of the engine compartment, then pivot to the turret ring. Wrench Jenkins, the gunner, had the sight picture perfectly. He understood that the King Tiger's roof armor was drastically thinner than its front, perhaps only 40 millimeters. Even an AP round from the 76 millimeters, striking at this steep upward angle, had a chance of penetration. The first 76 millimeters round screamed out of the Iron Maiden and struck the engine deck of Tiger 205. The shot failed to penetrate the steel grills, but the force buckled the metal and likely damaged internal fans or radiators. Harris, the loader, was a whirlwind of speed, ramming the second round into the breech. Up, 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 he grunted. The second round was aimed higher, just behind the commander's cupola, striking the top of the turret. Again, no clean penetration, but the impact showered the crew inside with spall, disorienting the commander and potentially fouling the turret traverse mechanism. The German crew realized their main gun was useless. They began firing their coaxial MG-34 machine gun wildly down the embankment, but the rounds only kicked up mud and harmlessly ricocheted off the Iron Maiden's custom-armored roof, which Kowalski had reinforced with a thick section of salvaged track plate back near Liege. The third 76 millimeters AP round hit the massive rear turret bustle, the section containing the ready-use ammunition. The shot created a blinding flash and a plume of black smoke. The round didn't cook off the internal ammunition, but the stress fracture was obvious. The King Tiger was beginning to burn, its great mass now a monument to its own engineering rigidity. Kowalski knew he hadn't destroyed Tiger 205 yet, but he had bought the Iron Maiden critical time. The priority now was getting out of the ravine and back onto the main road to clear the junction. Miller, fine purchase. We need to climb out. 45 degrees left. Follow the dry streak. Climbing out was harder than sliding in. The Sherman was struggling. The tracks spun on the slick mud. The engine screamed under the enormous load. The unauthorized modifications Kowalski had made to the transmission using stronger, custom-ground gears were the only reason the M4 didn't immediately strip the gear train and seize up. They needed grip. At 11:46 a.m., Kowalski had a terrible thought. He ordered the driver to engage the track slightly, and then he climbed back out of the turret, exposed to the wild machine gun fire of the burning King Tiger above. Wrench and Harris were shouting at him over the intercom to get back in. Kowalski ignored them. He was carrying 2 heavy metal crowbars and a thick length of logging chain tools scavenged from a farmer, spun earlier that week. His plan was to use the crowbars as temporary, disposable grip cleats, jamming them under the tracks as they rotated, allowing the tank to essentially climb over them. It was a maneuver usually reserved for recovery vehicles, not a tank under direct enemy fire, and it risked crippling the track system permanently. He had 40 seconds to position the improvised cleats before the King Tiger potentially managed to depress its secondary G42 machine gun enough to rake the ravine floor. The process was brutally simple and lethal. Wait for the track to lift, jam the bar into the track path, let the track roll over the bar, gaining precious inches of elevation, then pull the bar out and repeat. The force exerted on the crowbars was incredible. The first bar bent instantly, but provided just enough temporary traction for the Sherman to gain 4 feet of height. "Harris, throw me the other one." Harris pushed the second crowbar out the hatch. Kowalski grabbed it, positioned it, and jammed it beneath the churning tracks. The Iron Maiden surged forward, propelled by its desperate, illegal engineering. At 11:47 a.m., the Sherman clawed its way out of the ravine and onto the main road, directly behind the still-burning King Tiger 205 and the immobilized Tiger 203. They were past the blockade. The King Tiger 205, still partially operational, tried one last desperate move, slowly traversing its turret to engage the Sherman that was now behind it. Kowalski didn't hesitate. Wrench one more AP round. Right through the engine deck, point-blank range. Finish it. Wrench fired the 76 millimeters. The round struck the engine deck at less than 50 yards. This time, the penetration was clean and immediate. The King Tiger exploded violently, its fuel and ammunition finally igniting. The junction was open. The Orphans had neutralized the 2 most dangerous tanks on that sector of the front line, using ingenuity, theft, and the mechanical limits of their own equipment. But the cost was enormous. The Iron Maiden was battered, the transmission was overheating, the tracks were damaged, and the hull armor was scarred by an 88 millimeters impact that should have killed them all. They had to keep moving, or their tactical victory would turn into a mechanical disaster. It was 11:50 a.m. The air at the Four Horsemen crossing reeked of burning oil, scorched diesel, and cooked steel. 2 King Tigers, the pride of the German armor defense in this sector, were smoking ruins. Major Vance's company, stalled for nearly an hour, began to surge forward, rolling past the wreckage. Inside the Iron Maiden, the atmosphere was not celebratory, but clinical. They had won, but the tank was critically damaged. "Miller, report on the tracks," Kowalski ordered, his voice flat. "Left track has major damage, Frank. That cleat job bent 3 links. Or holding, but the vibration is bad. I can't push over 15 miles an hour. Wrench, engine temperature." Wrench checked the gauge with grim concentration. "Running in the red, sir." That high-power reverse pull up the ravine cooked the transmission oil. "We need at least an hour to cool down, maybe more to get new fluid in there." The Iron Maiden was limping. The very improvisational repairs and reckless maneuvering that had won them the battle now threatened to strand them deeper inside enemy territory. They were a mechanical time bomb. As the column passed, Major Vance pulled his own Sherman alongside the Iron Maiden. The Major climbed out, walking quickly toward Kowalski, who was leaning out of the turret, covered in mud and welding soot. "Sergeant Kowalski," Vance said, his voice a low blend of respect and fury. "What the hell was that maneuver? And where did you get those bloody steel cleats? You know the damage that causes the running gear." Kowalski simply pointed a muddy hand toward the 2 incinerated King Tigers. "Major, we eliminated 2 Type BS and cleared the junction without waiting for artillery. We're moving forward." Vance sighed, running a hand over his tired face. He saw the dents on the Iron Maiden's hull, the places where the crude aluminum canteen armor had fractured, but absorbed the kinetic energy of the 88 millimeters. He saw the battered tracks and the unmistakable smell of an overheating engine. "You saved the column. Frank, you also probably ruined a transmission that the Ordnance Corps won't replace for a month," Vance stated. "But we're alive." The dilemma now shifted from tactical engagement to logistical survival. They had to keep moving, but the Iron Maiden was dying. "We need a place to stop, Major," Kowalski said. "We need a motor pool. If we try to push another mile, the gearbox will lock up and we'll lose the tank entirely. We can't stop now. We have infantry pushing up the road, and the bridgehead is 5 miles away," Vance countered. "You drive until she stops, Sergeant." Kowalski shook his head. the fatigue momentarily overriding his discipline. "With respect, Major, if we drive until she stops, we lose the tank. If you give me 20 minutes in a working garage, I can fix her enough to make the push." Vance looked around the ruined junction. There was a small, intact building 50 yards off the road. A German municipal waterworks facility, seemingly abandoned. 20 minutes. "That's all you get, Kowalski. If the Germans counterattack, you abandon the tank and join the infantry," Vance ordered. "You and your orphans get that tank operational. And Kowalski, next time you melt down government-issue canteens, at least give me a week's notice so I can report them lost to enemy action." Vance's grudging approval was the only validation Kowalski ever needed. At 11:55 a.m., the Iron Maiden pulled off the main road and into the waterworks facility. The rest of the column streamed past, the sound of the tanks a low metallic roar. The real fight for the orphans was just beginning. They had 20 minutes to perform emergency surgery on a massive war machine. The priority: cool the transmission and repair the most dangerously stressed section of the track to prevent a total failure. Wrench and Miller immediately grabbed specialized tools. Wrench deployed a small, unauthorized high-pressure siphon pump stolen from a fire truck in Belgium to rapidly drain the overheated transmission fluid. The liquid pouring out was black, thick, and smelled burned. Kowalski, meanwhile, was focused on the left track. The damage caused by his improvised cleat had stretched and twisted the metal, threatening to throw the track off the drive sprocket entirely. They didn't have replacement track links. The solution had to be immediate and brutal. Kowalski grabbed a massive 8-pound sledgehammer and 2 heavy steel blocks. He intended to beat the bent track links back into shape, cold working the metal under immense pressure, a repair technique designed for a blacksmith shop, not a combat zone. He needed to be quick, precise, and ignore the protest of the damaged steel, or the Iron Maiden would become a permanent, immobile monument to their desperate fight. The clock was ticking. The silence of the waterworks facility was deceiving. Just outside the walls, the sounds of battle were receding as the American advance pushed further, but the danger of isolated German patrols or an artillery spotter remained acute. It was 11:58 a.m. The orphans had 17 minutes remaining on Major Vance's clock. Kowalski was beneath the tank, positioned precariously between the road wheel assemblies. With the massive sledgehammer, he began the brutal work of cold-setting the bent track links. Each swing was a testament to raw force meeting damaged metal. Clang, clang, clang. The sound echoed inside the concrete building, a horrifying advertisement for their position. Wrench, meanwhile, was working on the transmission. They didn't have fresh transmission oil, a scarcity in the final months of the war. Instead, Wrench was using a batch of high-grade automotive engine oil, much thinner than the required specification mixed, with a stolen container of industrial graphite lubricant. It was a terrible stopgap solution that would only last a few hours, but it was enough to keep the gears moving without immediately welding themselves together. Fluid in, temperature dropping slowly. Wrench reported, slamming the dipstick back into the transmission housing. "We might get an extra hour of run time out of this junk." Kowalski emerged from beneath the hull, sweat and grease streaking his face. He examined the damaged track. It was ugly, uneven, and dangerously stressed, but the critical twist had been hammered out. It would hold for now. "Harris, get me the welding gear again," Kowalski commanded. He noticed a section of the King Tiger's track links, massive, heavy, 30-inch wide pieces of steel line near the burning wreck 50 yards away. They were too heavy to lift and install as permanent track sections, but Kowalski had a final desperate idea for reinforcement. At 12:05 p.m., with the clock rapidly winding down, Kowalski and Wrench sprinted out to the King Tiger wrecks. They used the cutting torch to slice off 2 large, thick sections of the dead German tank's track link pins. These pins were made of ultra-hardened, high-grade German steel, designed for maximum durability. Back at the Iron Maiden, they rapidly welded these massive pins diagonally across the previously damaged American track links, creating a temporary splint. This illegal act of combining U.S. and German steel and using high-stress welding methods was a huge risk, but it distributed the running pressure and prevented the newly straightened links from twisting back out under load. By 12:12 p.m., the Iron Maiden was operational again. The entire crew had worked in a state of hyper-focused urgency, performing mechanical tasks that should have required a full maintenance company and heavy lifting equipment. Kowalski climbed back into the commander's seat. He checked the radio. The Advance was now 3 miles ahead, meeting stiff resistance near the edge of Urpel. They were alone at the junction, and the 20-minute deadline had expired. "Miller, we are done. Get us moving," Kowalski ordered. "Full speed to catch the column. If the engine blows, we go on foot." The Iron Maiden lurched back onto the road, the tracks groaning under the improvised repairs. The Sherman was faster now, the patchwork transmission surprisingly responsive. They were chasing the sound of the guns, leaving the shattered wreckage of their desperate battle behind. The final 2 miles were a blur of high-speed maneuvers, avoiding anti-tank ditches and small arms fire. They finally caught the rest of the column at 12:35 p.m., just as the lead elements were preparing to assault a heavily fortified rail yard. Major Vance's face was grim when he saw the Iron Maiden pull up. He didn't ask how they did it. He simply looked at the massive, ugly weld marks on the track and the deep gouges on the aluminum side plates. "Kowalski, you made it. Now you're on the front line. The rail yard has heavy defenses, and we need fire support. You still in the fight?" "Affirmative, Major," Kowalski replied, tapping the turret plating, the plates forged from melted-down canteens. "The Iron Maiden is ready for the next round." They had survived the impossible, not through official doctrine, but through the desperate ingenuity of mechanics who understood that in war, the greatest advantage is the willingness to abandon the rules and force the equipment beyond its limits. They had taken on the German King Tigers and won, armed with a cutting torch, a sledgehammer, and a collection of stolen aluminum mess kits. The Orphans were not heroes in the mold of official history. They were simply survivors, welding their way through the final, desperate weeks of the war. Their story deserves to be told. The Iron Maiden continued its push toward the Rhine. For the next 3 weeks, Staff Sergeant Frank Kowalski and the Ordnance Orphans fought on, their tanks surviving engagements that crippled many others. The aluminum canteen armor held, deflecting or destabilizing rounds that should have been lethal. The custom-welded track links held. The jury-rigged transmission kept working, sputtering occasionally, but always pulling the tank forward. Kowalski's unit was never officially recognized for their modifications. After the war, when the Iron Maiden was eventually mothballed and inspected by the Ordnance Corps, the report labeled the custom armor plates and track repairs as unauthorized, structurally unsound, and entirely irresponsible. The official narrative had no room for soldiers melting down government property to save their lives. It only wanted standardized compliance. The story of the canteen armored Sherman and the men who fabricated their own protection was buried in classified technical reports, deemed too dangerous to morale and discipline to be publicly discussed. But the legacy of the Ordnance Orphans wasn't measured in commendations or official history. It was measured in survival rates. The 743rd Tank Battalion, the unit that unofficially sanctioned Kowalski's engineering methods, finished the war with some of the highest operational readiness percentages in the European theater. Their tanks, battered, ugly, and non-compliant, simply kept moving when others failed. Frank Kowalski survived the war and returned to Chicago, eventually using his illegal welding skills to start a successful construction business. He never spoke much about the King Tigers or the time he hammered a tank back together under 88 millimeters fire, but he kept a single small, melted piece of aluminum in his toolbox, a jagged fragment of a canteen that had saved his life at the Remagen approach. The story of the Ordnance Orphans reminds us that the history of war isn't just written by generals and battle plans, but by the soldiers on the ground, the mechanics, the improvisers, and the desperate engineers who defied the manual to ensure they saw the next sunrise. They prove that in the crucible of combat, ingenuity and sheer force of will are often the most valuable weapons an army possesses. If this story of desperation and survival engineering moved you, don't just click away. Hit like, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, the United States, the UK, Canada, or somewhere else, and whether anyone in your family served in World War II, especially in the technical or armor units. You are part of the reason these men aren't erased from history. Frank Kowalski and the crew of the Iron Maiden paid the price for survival. All we're asked to do is remember. Never forget.